Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
I could get used to that. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Harold Bailey, Chair of Team Westport, and on behalf of Team Westport, the Westport Library, the Westport Museum of History and Culture, I want to welcome you to this pre-Juneteenth session tonight. When I was a kid, one of the things people used to say was that history repeats itself. And when I got a little older, what I heard was, well, it doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I would say we are at a point in this country right now where understanding that rhyming couldn't be more important. Rhymes for things, what rhymes with not the best people that drove some of the anti-Semitism in the 30s. Things like rapists and murderers that are ascribed to a group that drove some of the lynching in the 1920s and 30s in this country. And it isn't just to remember things that were awful because you want to demonize somebody else or go after them. But as a country, it's the kind of thing that we as a national community need to understand and get resolved so that our future doesn't include those kind of mistakes. Juneteenth as a holiday is an opportunity for us as a country to focus on some of those things and to try to reach some understanding and some resolution about how far we've come and how far we need to go. And it's with all of us treating each other with mutual respect across the country. Tonight, we couldn't be more blessed than to have our local expert, who, by the way, is a national as well as regional expert on history and culture, and that is Ramin Ganeshram. Ramin is author of at least half a dozen books. I think it might be over 10 now. But she is a specialist who's focused on culinary history. She's an award-winning journalist, also formerly a reporter for the New York Times. She has won a number of awards, but I am proudest of the work that she did when she was a member of Team Westport before she became the executive director of the Museum of History and Culture here in Westport. I remember the first time I heard this idea she had, which was, hey, why don't we go take a look at the history of Black people in Westport? And I said, you gotta be kidding. What history? She said, no, let me do it. I'd like to go research it. And she approached that with the ferocity of just a major investigator and researcher in what she did. And what ended up happening was an exhibit called Remembered, which has not only won awards around this region, but won awards from the state, won awards nationally, and has served as a kind of a template for being able to go out and do the investigative history about people and cultures across this country. It's really put the museum on the map, and she was already there, but it's elevated her presence as well. She's also one of the national experts on really the George Washington's chef, and she's written a book on that already, and that book is, let me get the title of it up. It's The General's Cook, and she has another book that's coming out that's going to follow that up that she's working on as well. So this is a powerhouse of an individual, and I couldn't be prouder and happier than to have her here tonight to spend some time with us. What we're going to do is she's going to come up and speak for a bit, and then we're going to sit down and have a conversation with you and get your questions, to which we will try to apply some answers. Ramin, welcome.
Wow, that made me sound really good. I better deliver. Thank you all for being here tonight. Really happy to have you to talk about this important topic. So before I start, there's a couple of things I want to tell you. You have a program in your hands that actually has some in-depth history over and above what I'm going to talk about tonight to give you, because everything we do at the museum we do with extreme rigor. But what I want to tell you about this particular program, it was based on an exhibit we did, I want to say 3 years ago, called Reluctant Liberators, Westport and the Civil War. But that exhibit was actually a student-run exhibit. We had a high school student, a senior from Staples. She's here with us tonight, Talia Moskowitz, she's in the back. And she worked with the museum over several months to research this exhibit using our collections material. We have an extensive archival collections that dates back into the 1690s. And so she used all of our Civil War material to put together an exhibit with our assistants. The flag that you see on your program is a 35-star American flag from the 1860s. It was when West Virginia was ratified as a state. In this period of history, there was a lot of ratifications of states, and so the flag had to keep getting updated. That flag is here tonight. It's in the back if you want to see it. We have some museum objects, including that flag, and you could see it. The last thing I'm going to tell you is that there's a portion of this program that's a little bit interactive. No heavy lifting, but I'm going to ask you to help me out with something a little bit later in the program. So, Juneteenth and Westport. So, Westport and the Civil War as a starting point. Show of hands, how many of you learned in school that Connecticut, obviously part of the Union, a great North Star, fully all in on joining the Union to fight the Civil War, to fight the South? Show of hands. Right, okay. So I'm going to give you some background, and then we're going to talk about Westport's heroes of Juneteenth. Okay, so I want to give you a background about particularly Connecticut, New England, with respect to the central question of the Civil War, which was slavery, right? So Connecticut was a state that was very complicitous in slavery, both in the Caribbean and the American South, because of commerce. And this was true of the state of New York as well, Rhode Island, absolutely, for example, Massachusetts, pretty much every one of the original 13. So Connecticut in the 17th and 18th centuries, the wealth in places like Westport was made in what was called provision farming. So I'm going to give you an example. If you were Ebenezer Coley and you had farms in what is today Coleytown that grew grain and wheat, and you had cattle and you also had eggs, the way you made money on this was somewhat for local sales, but it would be to bring it down the toll highway, which is 136 Main Street, and you would pay tolls along the way to bring it to your store in downtown Saugatuck, which is what we now call downtown Westport. Saugatuck Village is what it was called at the time. And your store, which is still there on the corner of Parker Harding and Main Street, some of you remember it as the Remarkable Bookstore, was Ebenezer Coley's Saugatuck store, and the water would come right up to the back of that store. And sloops would come right up to the back of that building, and it would be loaded with your corn, your dried corn, and your wheat, and your eggs, and your dried beef to be sent to the Caribbean to feed enslaved people on plantations in places like Jamaica. And the reason is because all the arable land in the Caribbean was used for sugar, because sugar was profitable. So farmers in New England and places like Connecticut made a great deal of money as part of what we call the triangular trade in provision farming. By the late 18th century, the cotton gin is invented by Eli Whitney in New Haven. The cotton gin allowed for, does anyone remember? You remember this from school? It was a machine that allowed seeds to be picked out of cotton, which was the most actually time-consuming aspect of cotton farming. But what this did was it leapfrogged the growth process and the abundance of cotton, which meant you needed labor, which actually then prolonged and increased slavery in the South. So that's another aspect of Connecticut's complicity. That same cotton would come back up through the 19th century to New England, to places like Massachusetts and to Connecticut, to be made into shirts, to be made into pants, to be made into other aspects of clothing for enslaved people, to be sold back to the American South. I'm trying to paint a picture for you here of the level of commercial interaction between Connecticut and the slavery economy. And the last I'll tell you is the insurance industry. So we have a great insurance industry in Hartford, Connecticut. It was started by insuring the bodies of enslaved people for their enslavers in the American South. Aetna Insurance basically got their start doing this. I'm telling you this for a reason. So just by way of background, Connecticut was the colony and later the state that had the most enslaved people in New England. Close to 6,500 counted people by the Revolutionary War. I say counted because, as we know, even today, census takers are not always accurate. Most of those enslaved people were in Fairfield County. Connecticut abolished slavery the last of all New England states and had the longest period of gradual abolition, 1748 to 1848. So that number, 1848, should be very meaningful to you. Only 12 years before the beginning of the Civil War. A little more than 12 years, right? So this is the background under which the Civil War comes to Connecticut. And so what happened was, people in Connecticut were really not pro-abolition. It wasn't sort of a great North Star of a state where people were saying, we're all in, we must fight the Union cause. I mean, Vermont did, but New York and Connecticut, not so much, because a lot of people's income and wealth were tied up in this. So what Connecticut had to do was issue a bounty system. So a bounty was really like a signing bonus, right? So if you were to sign up as a Union soldier, you would be able to get a certain amount of money just for signing up. And the reason they had to do this was because men in Connecticut were not signing up to fight. They had to issue a bounty. One of the most well-known in this town people who took the bounty to fight is a man named Benjamin Tokay. You all know Tokay Hall. It was his son who built Tokay Hall. But so he took the bounty. We have incredible letters from him in our collection while he's at the front, writing back to Westport while he's stationed in Louisiana. These are actually men from Connecticut. These are Connecticut soldiers. These are officers. They were down, I think, in Mississippi. So, so what I'm trying to explain to you is that, yes, Connecticut fought and Westport fought, but it was a little bit of a tooth pull. Okay, so, but ultimately people did sign up, men signed up. These are the men from Westport in totality who did fight. In total, 187 men out of 215 from Westport survived, 27 died, 3 perished from disease, 7 were killed, 17 died of other causes. Of the 7 that were killed, 2 were killed at Gettysburg, 20 men were wounded, 20 were prisoners of war, and 45 men deserted. So this is an interesting question. You'll see an article in your program about these deserters from the town. It was not uncommon. Desertion happened throughout the Army, but there's a really kind of interesting thing that happened here in the 70s with the then Historical Society around Westport's deserters. So 2 of the most prominent men, this gentleman here is in a silhouette because we actually don't have a picture of him. His name was Lewis R. McDonough. I'm going to tell you about him in a minute. This gentleman is Henry Moses Judah. He was a brigadier general. He was a career military officer. He went to West Point. He did serve during the war. He ultimately died of illness. His friend Lewis McDonough brought his body back here to Westport. The reason we like to talk about Brigadier General Judah is because his grandfather was the first Jewish resident of Westport. He came here during the Revolutionary War to escape anti-Semitism in occupied New York during the Revolution. So McDonough is really interesting because he was a lieutenant. He served a tour of duty, but then he resigned his post to do something very specific and very important to this discussion of Juneteenth. He resigned his post and voluntarily signed up to be a lieutenant with the 29th Connecticut Regiment. The 29th Connecticut Regiment was one of two regiments that was later called the 29th and the 30th, the Connecticut Colored Regiment. And so these were black men who basically enlisted to fight. So he was with them when they had arguably, they were at Richmond when Richmond burned, but they were also in Texas for Juneteenth. So let's talk about these black soldiers, because it's really an amazing and really quite remarkable story. So as I told you, gradual abolition happened 1784, 1848. But what happened was, what gradual abolition said was that if you were born after March 1st, 1784, by the time you reached the age of 25, you would become free. If you were born the day before, then you would be enslaved for life, right? And you would reach, you would gain your freedom by the time you became 25 years old, right? So that happened, but as men, right? Because in these days, rights were given to men, right? So as black men reached the age of 25 and became free, they were allowed to vote because the Connecticut Charter did not have a race restriction in voting. So as these men started to register to vote, there was a lot of outcry, and the state legislature in 1818 included a race restriction on voting. This is going to become important later. So essentially, although people were gaining their freedom, they were emancipated, their liberty to conduct a full life, to have protection under law, to be represented in the state legislature and in the Congress by their vote did not happen. Nonetheless, men from this area decided that they were going to fight on the side of the civil, obviously on the Union side in the Civil War, and they formed what was called the 29th and 30th Connecticut Colored Infantry. So 1863, January, the Emancipation Proclamation is signed, right? And what it said was that actually freed, this is a little bit of a misunderstood document. It actually freed people in the border states, right, of the Northern Territory, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and West Virginia. And it allowed for the enlistment of African-American soldiers into the Union. On May 22nd of the same year, the Bureau of Colored Troops was created by the federal government. So November of that year, Connecticut's governor is now authorizing the creation of basically guards units from Connecticut, the 29th and 30th Colored Infantry. So Connecticut Democrats, and I just want you to understand that the parties were different, right? The Democrats of this period is more like what we would call Republicans now, and vice versa, actually were very much against this. They did not want black men to fight in the Union Army. And so representatives throughout the state denounced the bill. So Westport's representative, John Wheeler, was very vocal. He argued that it would unleash a horde of African barbarians onto the South, and they believed that if the North would lose if black soldiers were allowed to fight, alleging black soldiers to be cowardly and disgraceful, and so on, right? So nonetheless, despite this, right, so I just want you to picture this. So these are men, they do not have rights under the law. It is a long road to freedom, and nonetheless, they're signing up to fight for the preservation of the Union as a whole, for the preservation of a country that did not serve them well to this point, right? So I want to read you some numbers. Less than 1.2% of Westport's population was black in 1860 census. There were only 14 men in this town who were eligible to sign up. 13 did so. Throughout the state, we have the same sort of figures. So while we had kind of anemic registration and enlistment across the board among white residents, 94% of the eligible African-American men in the state of Connecticut signed up to fight for the Union during the Civil War. Who were they? As I said, there was about 1,600 men. 13 of the eligible 14. 1,200 black men joined the 29th Regiment, 400 joined the 30th. This is a great quote. This is an incredible, incredible book. So part of our work is to find arcane resources that are out of print. And this was a book written by a man who served in the 29th, and he wrote about his time. He says that they also had been promised a bounty of $15 on their enlistment, but it didn't happen. And it wasn't allowed, right? And he says, but we did not shirk our duty just because we had not received our just dues. Again, this kind of incredible will to try to create the more perfect nation that was promised. So this is also an incredible story. Frederick Douglass met these men after they were drilling in Fairhaven, Connecticut. Fairhaven is a part of New Haven, for those of you who don't know. That picture in the beginning of the presentation was taken there in New Haven, Connecticut. I just want to read this to you. You are the pioneers of the liberty of your race, with the United States cap on your head, the United States eagle on your belt, the United States musket on your shoulder. Not all the powers of darkness can prevent you from becoming American citizens. And not for yourselves alone are you marshaled, you are the pioneers. On you depends the destiny of 4 million of the colored race in this country. If you rise and flourish, we shall rise and flourish. If you win freedom and citizenship, we shall all share your freedom and citizenship. So this is this incredible spirit, right, that these men go off to war. So this is in Mill River in Fairhaven, Connecticut. So here's the incredible part of the story. So we have our men, Westport men, that long list I showed you, and these 13 men, and they serve their time. Ultimately, June 19th, 1865, they go to Galveston, Texas. They arrive there around June 10th, and they are part of the group of soldiers who get to read the proclamation by Major General Gordon Granger, that the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation of the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. So you might think, but there was an Emancipation Proclamation. What happened? Well, basically Texas, as Texas tends to do, did its own thing and refused to honor the federal law. Obviously, that's why there was a war going on, right? So you had the Union Army. You had black soldiers able to come and tell people who had been held in illegal bondage that they were free. It's an incredible moment. So here's the interactive part that I want you all, if you will, to do with me. These are Westport's Freedom Fighting 14. These are the 14 men, the 13 African-American men, and their Lieutenant Louis R. McDonough, who served. I feel like we need to put some respect on their names and read it out loud, and I would like it if you would read it with me if you feel comfortable to doing so. Private Samuel Benson, Private Thomas Benson, Private James Burns, Private John Fry, Private Thomas Gregory, Musician Frank Jackson, Private Joseph H. Jackson, Private William H. Jackson, Private William H. Johnson First, Private William H. Johnson II, First Lieutenant Louis R. McDonough, Private John Thompson, Private Charles C. Williams, Private Charles Yan Tross. So what happened after the war? So these men come back, and Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, refuses black suffrage until 1870. When I say suffrage, I mean the right to vote, right? So there was national emancipation. No one could be enslaved, right? Obviously by the end of the war, 1865. So I guess I should say, I'm sure you all know this, but your right to vote is conferred upon you by your state, not by the federal government. The federal government does not give you the right to vote. It is not in the United States Constitution. It's in the state constitution, which is what allows states to create voting laws that prevent people from voting, right? So the state of Connecticut refused to allow newly freed black men, even those who fought for the Union, to vote until the 15th Amendment forced them to do so with its ratification in 1870. The 15th Amendment says that nobody shall be hindered from suffrage regardless of previous condition of servitude. Then the state of Connecticut, these same men, these brave men, wanted to create basically a guards unit, right? The state, of course, creates the National Guards unit to continue to drill and have preparedness for war. One of the real issues in the Civil War and the previous wars is the United States didn't have a standing army. The way we do now, we have standing military. They're always at readiness. Well, we didn't have that. So that's why you had to try to enlist people and muster them and give them bounties and so on. Well, these men wanted to, essentially join or create their own National Guards unit to train in New Haven, Connecticut, and the state said no. The state would not let them do it. So here's the incredible thing that I want to tell you about these men. They did it on their own, and they did it for multiple generations. They continued to train younger men to be prepared to fight battle. And so when the United States entered into World War I, these units, because it happened elsewhere in the country too, were the only ones who had military preparedness to go over to France and fight. So, with that said, I'm so happy to take questions, but I just want to tell you a couple of things. Tomorrow we're having 2 Black History tours based on our exhibit Remembered that Harold talked about. 10 o'clock and 3:30. That's a QR code to register. I think we have some space left. Love to see any of you. And then, actually, on Sunday, we are celebrating Pride with Westport Pride. With their white party is going to be held on our property. So, and there's a ticket for that. If you guys want to come, we would be happy to see you. And I think Harold's going to come up. And the last thing I want to say is, if you enjoyed this talk, if you want to know more, please support our work. We would love to see you. Please visit. We have walking tours. We have programs. We're not funded by the town, and any help is appreciated. So thank you. Now you see how short I really am.
It'll lift you up.
So should it,
Yeah,
we sit here and take some questions?
Sure.
I think so, yeah. I have to tell you all, sorry for that fire hose of information, but I've learned something as a historian. We tend to get into these weeds. Unless we talk fast, we get off topic, and we get really into these details of history that most people are like, oh, please stop talking. So hopefully that was just enough to get you excited about the topic.
Yeah, so we wanted to open it up now for any questions, anything around Civil War, Juneteenth.
So if you have a question, I should say, please walk up to the microphone so the recording can capture your audio.
Adam?
I absolutely love that, and every time I hear you speak, Ramin, I always learn something new.
Thank you.
I'm really curious to know what happened to all those families. I mean, if they were so devoted to supporting their role in the Army, and they were really clearly strong residents here, is there any lineage? Is there any continuance of any of the people who were involved?
Yeah, so one of the difficulties about museum work, right? We did all this work for the purposes of an exhibit. So we could probably continue to do genealogy to find out what happened to these individuals and their families. I mean, we certainly could. It's just that the resources are not there to do it kind of for the sake of simple historical inquiry. We would love to. I can tell you generally, kind of going forward in terms of Black history in Westport, the numbers, obviously, I think it's not a surprise to anybody here, of people of color in the town have dwindled and dwindled. But Westport was actually very much a commercial center in shipping, right? So up until the 1940s, I would say, the downtown still was a working harbor. And so there were a number of black families who lived in the town. Many of the men worked on the docks, they worked on the ships. There were many black families that came up with the Great Migration and worked in the town as well. But these particular men, we have not done the work to find out what happened to them.
Any other? Well, I'll just say between 1820 and 1860, the United States went from being an agrarian economy that was kind of just getting along to the fastest growing economy the world had ever seen. And that was because of the cotton gin and the ability all of a sudden for cotton to become a textile that was affordable all over the world. The Europeans went berserk for it. But one of the things that also happened was that the generations of people for the first 200 years of enslavement in this country, the generations of people that had been promised their freedom or their children were going to be freed, all of a sudden became worth gold. And a number of different promises that had been made were completely betrayed. And what we saw in the country all of a sudden was just row after row of people in shackles going from the north to the south to farm, to pick cotton, in effect. The more land you had, the more cotton you could grow. The more cotton you could grow, the more money you could make. And one of the things around the complicity, if you speak on this, is Wall Street. Wall Street was was a financial center that literally was, instead of talking about dollars, they were talking about hands. A hand was a human being. And so people were granted money based on the number of hands that they had, or that they owned in plantations. So when we talk about complicity, the core financial energy of the whole country out of Wall Street was a part of this as well. But
yeah, and I think what's interesting about the cotton gin is that enslavement was starting to peter out in New England and in the Mid-Atlantic. It was starting to be considered a problematic institution for a lot of reasons. Like if you read, the papers of Washington, which I spend a lot of time reading, you could see this is something he grappled with because it was both financially increasingly not viable and then also unpopular. When he was president in Philadelphia, he had 9 enslaved people with him and actually was very much reviled by the community in Philadelphia because Pennsylvania had enacted gradual abolition in 1780. So by the 1790s, like we always think about Washington as this revered figure, but in his own time, people were not happy about this, that he had done this. But when the cotton gin was invented, that then reignited, as Harold just described, this need for enslaved labor, and it was kind of almost out the door, and then the cotton gin reignited it. But so I'll tell you all an incredible story that I just came across, and I actually haven't written about this, so you're the first to really hear about this. So I was recently in Virginia doing research at the Virginia Museum for History and Culture, and I was reading through some documents, and there was this diary that was attributed to a woman named Mary Fitzhugh Custis. So Mary Fitzhugh Custis was married to a man named George Washington Parke Custis. He was Martha Washington's grandson and raised by Martha and George in the president's house. And so the attribution, that's who it's attributed to, and I'm reading this diary, and she was kind of, it's interesting, she was an abolitionist, like with some caveats, right? Like there was a lot of this abolition as long as it didn't affect me. Washington was like this too, right? It happened here in the North as well. So in this document, which is quite incredible, she's writing about what she wanted to do was to end slavery by repatriating people to Liberia. This was her solution. send African Americans to Liberia. And she was gonna raise money to do this. And she's talking about how it's her fondest wish that this should happen. And she's, and I'm reading it and she's saying, it was her mother's greatest wish. And so I realized that it's not Mary Fitzhugh Custis's diary, it's her daughter's, right? And so what she says in this is so important. This deed is so important that this must be done, that I fear even my husband and my children will not be spared in the effort to make this so. So Mary Fitzhugh Custis's daughter, it would be better known to you as Mrs. Robert E. Lee. So they had mislabeled the diary, right? And I realized it from reading it, because when you work with the documents of the enslaved, they appear as little threads and little pieces in the historical record. So for someone like me, I have to read every line and every page. I cannot skim documents, and that's how I figured it out. So this is 1853. It's a bizarrely prescient comment that nobody would be spared. And in the end, where she lived, Arlington House, her father's home, her father's plantation, Arlington House, in fact, became the National Cemetery at Arlington, right? Because Union troops were buried there during the war, very specifically buried there because she and Robert E. Lee lived there with her parents, right? So it's it was very complicated at the time. In the end, she was pretty unhappy about the whole thing and kind of recanted all of her abolitionist fervor, but it's so intricately wrapped up into the history of America, and so that's why we have to talk about it. But to me, one of the main reasons to keep talking about this, not only because it's the truth, is can you imagine the bravery of these men who enlisted? So even Lieutenant McDonough, who, by the way, is buried at Evergreen Cemetery. We have members of the Church Council and the Board of Saugatuck Congregational Church here tonight who worked with the museum to mark the grave of Lewis McDonough, who was the white lieutenant who led the 29th and 30th Colored Infantry, the 29th. He's buried at Evergreen Cemetery. But here's what I want to tell you about him. If you were a white lieutenant leading black infantry and you were captured, you were not afforded any courtesy of war. You were killed on the spot because the Confederacy was so offended by leading black men into battle. And similarly, black soldiers were, they received less money. They had to pay for their own uniforms where white soldiers didn't. And to be captured by the Confederacy was a horror. First you would be re-enslaved immediately, and you would be re-enslaved in the worst possible ways. All slavery is the worst possible, but they would find the most horrific things, right? So imagine their bravery, imagine their mettle to still fight instead of sitting back. I mean, I don't know that I would have done it. I would have been like, this is your problem, you solve it. I'm gonna sit back, right? They didn't. The fact that 13 of those men are right from this town, I think we should be very, very proud.
Any other questions?
Yeah, please
Eric?
go to the.
Please.
Hi guys, good evening. Eric Freeman. Thank you for this discussion, it's incredible. If you could talk a little bit more about the politics of the time, the state and local legislators. I mean, it seems like you had people who were this conflict of people who knew morally what was the right thing to do, but other people who were benefiting from, the profits from slavery. So can you talk a little bit more about the figures of the time and some of who was making decisions and who some of those people were and what they were doing?
In the state of Connecticut, or?
Yeah, in the state of Connecticut.
Yeah, so essentially, I do not remember the name of or probably any of the legislators at the time, but one prominent person right here in Westport who was first a state senator, state representative, and then became a congressman is Richard Henry Winslow Park, right? So his home, Campo House, was there in the park. And he was a very early, starting to be an abolitionist. He was a quiet abolitionist. We have an incredible a book from his house in our archives that is a guest book for his home, Campo House. And on the 4th of July, he held fireworks, and this is in the 1850s. And one of the people that he had invited was a man called Elihu Burritt, and he was called the Learned Carpenter, and he was an abolitionist who was from Massachusetts, and he was very active in traveling through New England to promote the cause of abolition. And so, the state representative essentially hosted him right here in Westport. And the purpose was to try to get the town government and other state legislators who were invited over to this cause, right? He was a very dynamic speaker. William Lloyd Garrison, who ran the Liberator magazine, often came to Connecticut because he felt that Connecticut was quite problematic, right? He actually called Connecticut the Georgia of the North because of the extent of enslavement and the nature of it here in this state. So you had a lot of national figures that really had eyes on the state, but the state was fairly, solidly anti-abolition. And the other thing about Connecticut, which is interesting, is that you've all heard the expression that Connecticut is the land of steady habits. You know that expression? That's actually a political expression. It's not a social expression. It was coined early in the 19th century because Connecticut voters would just vote the way they always did. Always, right? And it became known nationally. That's Connecticut, land of steady habits. They're just going to keep voting for whoever's there. So when you had this anti-abolition, pro-slavery, the commerce of slavery, state legislature and town legislatures, and people men, right, because that's who could vote, were continually just voting down the same ticket. That was kind of the political climate of the time. There were towns that were exceptions, Colchester, Connecticut being one of them, interestingly enough. I found, I learned that recently doing research. I think somebody else had a question, and
I do.
oh, there you do.
Yeah, I was wondering, you have the title up there, Reluctant Liberators, describing Connecticut. What's Connecticut's role or activism in reparations?
You mean after the war?
Yeah, or now?
Or now? Well, that's a good question. I mean, not really much of a role, I would say. I think that now, as in all times in history, there are certain really remarkable people doing amazing work, right? And for example, just recently, Josh Koskoff of Westport, of the law firm Koskoff and Koskoff, won an incredible legal battle against Harvard University over photographs that were taken of an enslaved man and his daughter and used by the university, commercialized by the university for years and years and years. And his fifth times great-granddaughter sued to get the pictures back. It was considered to be an absolutely non-winnable case. Mm-hmm. They won it. They just won it a few weeks ago, right? So I think that, this is just my opinion as a historian, I think that it's a mistake when we look at whole towns, whole states, whole nations, and want to ascribe singular behavior, right, to a cause or to a moment in history. So can we say as a whole the state is pro-reparation? No, I don't think commercially any state would say that they were, right? Are there people doing incredible work? Absolutely. And in the South too, in places like Texas.
What I see is that Connecticut has been, we're in the North, we didn't have any slaves. That's not our issue.
But we did.
That's what I'm talking.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. The story is why involve us? We were
So let me understand. You're saying that you feel that maybe the perception on a
Yes.
lot of the public is that there were no enslaved people in Connecticut
Right.
in the North, and therefore the question of reparations should not affect us, right?
Exactly.
So this is a matter of education, right? And this is why it's really important to, frankly, support institutions that are doing the work to surface this truth based on the primary sources, right? Because it's there. The material is there. Same thing with the state of New York. Slavery didn't end in the state of New York until 1827, right? And so it's there, it's just that we're not taught it in school, right? And it's available, so seek out the institutions. I think the most powerful act of activism anybody can do is do the research yourself. The receipts are there. They're there. Nobody is hiding this material, right? The people who did these deeds, Ebenezer Coley enslaved 12 people here in Westport. The records are at the museum. He didn't hide it, right? Because in that period of time, it was a commercial venture, right? I mentioned Benjamin Tokay. He wrote letters back home of his observations of the South and African Americans in the South, and they're not complimentary, and they're there. He did it because in that period of time, there were enough people to say that that was okay. So I'm saying this to say, every one of you can access this material and see the truth for yourself. It's important to go do it. And then tell other people, right? You think that there were not enslaved people in Connecticut. There were enslaved people in this town. The museum property, there were 2 enslaved people who moved between the Coley farm, our property, and the store that I mentioned later became the Remarkable Bookstore. So any one of you who have been in that building or our building have trod the floorboards of bound people, right? It is important to go find out that information and share it.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great question.
Thank you. My name is Dennis Wong. I'm with the Westport Sunrise Rotary. And I just wondered, what about the women of Westport, the Black African women? You talked about the men and fighters. What do we know about the women, their wives or daughters or whatever?
Thank you so much for asking that. That's a great question. And in your pamphlet there's actually an article about women. So the wives and the daughters, not only of the Black soldiers, but all of Westport's Union soldiers, they took the work, they filled the roles of the vacated work of the men in Westport who went to fight. So we often talk about this with World War II, right? We talk about Rosie the Riveter, and we talk about women stepping out of the home to fill the workforce and work in factories. Well, that's what happened. That's what happened here too. These women were working in factories in jobs that the men had to vacate to fight. The Saugatuck River, when we look out at the river and our beautiful view of the river, actually in this period of time in the 1860s, there were factories lining the river. There was a mattress factory, there was a embalming fluid factory, which is kind of creepy, but we do actually have some of the old bottles in our collections of the embalming fluid supply company, a coffin tack factory, there was a twine and thread factory. The Westport Country Playhouse was a leather factory called the Kemper Tannery. So there was a lot of factories and work that was now abandoned, and that's what these women did. And it's an interesting thing because it was written about a lot at the time, because after the war was over, now these women, just like during World War II and World War I as well, found themselves being pushed back into the home, denied suffrage, the right to vote, and yet they had literally kept, commercial and home fires going during the Civil War.
Hi. I know that after the Civil War, I think it was the first war where the federal government got very serious about benefits for veterans. And I'm curious whether the Black regiments benefited from those programs. Not clear to me that they did.
So actually, the government gave benefits to soldiers as early as the Revolutionary War. There were pensions, and even in that war, black men who did fight, and that's also very interesting, and I will not get into the weeds, but long discussion of black soldiers in the Revolutionary War. I will say this, the Revolutionary War was the last time that black and white soldiers were integrated in the American military until Korea.
Yeah.
But yes, all soldiers were allowed pensions, and they just had to, submit for the pensions. So that did happen, yeah.
There was a differential.
There was a differential. The pay was less. That's 100% true. Later, after World War II and Korea, a lot of the benefits of the GI Bill that white soldiers got were not, that level was not given to black soldiers. And the same thing was true in all wars. But yes, pensions were available.
Thanks.
And we were just talking about women, and of course there's Harriet Tubman. And everybody knows about the Underground Railroad and how she went back and brought a number of people north. But what may not be known is that she was one of the first officers, first black, not just black, the first woman officer inside the Union Army. And she not only led the strategy for some troops in some key battles in the South, but she put together the whole network of spying that enabled the Union Army to win some very significant battles. After the war, it turns out she was denied her pension.
Yeah.
Because women weren't supposed to be in the Army, and it took an act of Congress literally another 30 years in order for them to finally grant her her stipend that she should have had as a soldier.
And she was colloquially called, while she was in that period of time, by Lincoln and other people, General Tubman. She was posthumously granted the rank of Brigadier General. One of the warships that is being stripped of her, the warship being stripped of her name currently is the Brigadier General Harriet Tubman. That's why she has a warship, because she is a general. But she was called that colloquially during the war by Lincoln and other people. But yes, women, even in the Revolutionary War, there were women who posed as men to fight, and they really had to fight hard to get their pensions.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask you about the image behind you. It looks like there are many black soldiers. So could you tell us a little bit about what that represents and where is that?
Yes, so this is the two infantry units, the 29th and the 30th, and they were training in New Haven. So this is a picture after they were, during their training drills in New Haven. There was a big camp called Camp Terry in New Haven, where all soldiers were being trained. So this is the 29th and the 30th. I guess I'm not a military historian. I don't know, Jay would tell us. What are they doing, Jay? Are they?
Probably some general walking down the line. Notice the officers standing in front with their swords. That's probably a salute to somebody, and they're all white.
So for the purposes of the recording, we have someone in the audience who has long been involved with the museum, who is a retired military officer, and he says that they are in line saluting somebody. You can see, because they have the sword up in the front, and all those who are being saluted are white officers. And in fact, there were no black officers. Just want to make that clear. Lieutenant McDonough was white.
I read a book about Harriet Tubman, and wasn't she like one of those people who did something with the herbs to heal people?
Yes, so Harriet Tubman and all the people many of the people who were involved with the Underground Railroad and who were involved with spy networks had to be very knowledgeable about herbal medicine or what may be called bush medicine, because if you can imagine, you're fleeing, it's usually nighttime, you can only use what you can take from the forest or from the land or from a river, right, to feed yourself, or if you get injured. So there's a lot of plants that are good medicine for a cut or if your stomach bothers you. And so she had to be really smart, not just on being a spy, but being a doctor, being a healer, knowing how to feed people, how to keep people safe. So yes, you're right, she absolutely did, and so did a lot of other people who did that same job. Thank you for that question.
In fact, she was, there's this recent book out that actually ties Harriet Tubman back to her grandmother's heritage in Africa. And her grandmother brought the knowledge of these different herbs and things here, as well as her, I guess her father's side of the family did as well. The grandmother was on her mother's side. Not only did she use it for the Underground Railroad, but later on during the Civil War, she had kind of the black nurses network that was built up that took care of colored soldiers who had been wounded. So that's a great question. Thank you.
So if there are no more questions, you know, what I always tell people is this. I know that these are really kind of very weighty and sometimes very troubling discussions, but Juneteenth is a joyful holiday, right? Because this is a day of celebration, and we're the last people who were made to be unaware of their free status were liberated, right? And even more joyful, the joy of being able to see your own people giving you the news, right? That you're now free, right? So this is an important holiday. It's a joyful holiday. I think we need to remember the history. We need to honor these men. But I think, you know, just remember the spirit of happiness that Juneteenth represents. If I could give you one thing to take away, that would be it. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.